Good evening, everybody. I hope you are doing well this evening, or afternoon, or morning, wherever you are in the world. And today we're going to be talking about emotion, specifically the passions and affections as they were understood in the early modern era. Now, why would we be interested in this topic? Well, I think for me, there's a couple of reasons. One is this is the area that I research, this is what I do my studies in, and particularly in early modern Britain and Scotland. And what I found in doing this is that actually really up until the 19th century, well, the 20th century, most philosophers and theologians, when they were studying and writing, they were deeply concerned about the role of emotion in our lives. It's an important part of who we are and how we experience the world. And they saw it as important to uh, understanding our relationships with God, understanding our relationships with other people in maybe in an interpersonal sense between friends or individuals, as societies as well. And so there's an interest in there. Why don't we try and find out about why they thought this was important? Moreover, I also think it's significant because in this kind of in the sphere that we've been many of us are in online, there's been a lot of debates recently about virtue and vice, particularly surrounding sexual desire. And the question really has been framed as such as should we at all restrain sexual desire, or should we allow it to be satisfied? Should we seek its satisfaction where possible, as long as it's not harming other people? Is this something that we should fulfill? And this is the constant kind of refrain. It's one of restrain or of pursuing these desires. And the early modern period, well, this gives us a bit of distance from a very modern context in discussing this and allows us to maybe probe some of these assumptions in play and maybe question whether both sides of this, whether we should frame it in this way. Are there any alternative approaches? And indeed, many of these discussions assume certain things about what an emotion is. We just take it for granted. It's a feeling. But what is the nature of that feeling? Is it a cognitive component to that? Is it completely physiological? Or does it have a spiritual dimension? Does it have a moral quality? Can we assess whether we have good emotions and bad emotions? These are all things that were discussed in the early modern era. And so, what I want to do is go through what you might say was the standard Christian theological approach to the passions and affections in the 16th and early 17th century, before the rise of Descartes' philosophy. Because with him and subsequent philosophy, there become certain changes in the understanding of emotion. But before that point, there's a rather consistent line. And I want to look at how they understood what an emotion is, what kinds of emotion they thought there were, and then how did they think morally or ethically about emotions, and thus maybe question some of the assumptions of our own day. Before we get going, let me say hello to everybody who's watching, in particular those who have said hello in the chat. Hello, Byron Brown Stepwise, John Comenenos, Doug Yeh, Vingle, Prince of Parma. It's great to see you all here. I'm really delighted that you're tuning in, and I'm delighted that for those who haven't commented as well are tuning in. So without further ado, let me get started. So probably the first place to begin is that in the early 17th century, so around, well, actually on 1600 itself, we start seeing in the British context a number of treatises being published upon the nature of what they would have called the passions and affections. In this time period, the word emotion does not refer to feelings per se, but rather is a tumult or trouble, a popular uprising of some kind. So emotion has a very different connotation. Rather, the closest term for what we would call an emotion is a passion or an affection. And these do have slightly different meanings, and we may get into those in due course. But for the purpose of this, by and large, they share a fundamental definition across various treatises. And this is because, whether written by Catholics or Protestants, there was a lot of agreement on the nature of the passions and affections. This was in part because they were inheriting a shared tradition, primarily from mediated through medieval Christianity of Thomas Aquinas's so-called treatise on the passions, which is a section of the Summa Theologica. And he himself is mediating Aristotelian, Augustinian, Stoic conceptions of the passions and blending them together into what we might call a Christian Aristotelianism. And this philosophy extends beyond just the understanding of the passions to the very nature of reality, metaphysics, to epistemology, to ethics, and so on. But but what's important to say here is, although these people are sharing the same worldview, there are subtle variations within their understanding of the passions. There's small bits that they'll change here or there. They'll add in a principle from a different kind of philosophy and modify the generic conception. So although there's broad agreement on what a passion is, there might be slight variations. Also, I should say as well that by and large, most of the people writing on these on the passions, on the nature of the passions, are reading the original sources. They're reading Aquinas, they're reading Aristotle, they're reading Desert Fathers and philosophers like Boethius. They're thoroughly engaged with the classical and patristic and medieval traditions, and with contemporary philosophy too, and physiology, so Galenic understandings of the passions, which are rather important in the Hippocratic tradition. So all of these things are being engaged with in this approach. It's not an isolated conversation about what the passions are. They're actually conversant with the traditions and thoroughly informed by them. And it's really with Descartes, who himself is thoroughly steeped in a kind of reacting against and adapting an Aristotelian theory of the passions, that we start to see a break away from this tradition which is built up over almost 1,000 years. So with all that, what we can say is that in the 16th and 17th centuries, there's a kind of consensus emerged through the development of these traditions. And what you arrive at is that a passion is, at its most basic level, a motion of the sensitive appetite, or a motion of the appetite. So let's break down this process. So first off, what's going to happen is something's going to trigger this process. And that is when an object is apprehended. Now, typically, when theologians or clerics are writing about this, they're going to talk about sensory objects. So you apprehend through one of your 5 senses an object. So let's say it's, at the moment, I've got a desk in front of me, so I can feel this desk and I can see it. And I could smell it if I really wanted to. So this object I've apprehended. You could also apprehend objects through your reasoning faculty. So these would be abstract objects like concepts or numbers. But typically they want to talk about sensory objects. And when you apprehend this object, this becomes what's known as the formal object of a passion. It's the thing that's going to trigger the process. Because when you apprehend it via your senses, it is then what we might say is evaluated. There's an instinctual judgment is brought about by an intuitive practical faculty. This initial judgment assesses whether the object is good or bad, but not just good or bad in a broad universal sense, but good or bad for me. We could also say, is it beneficial or harmful for me? Put it like this. So a sheep is grazing in a field and then it sees a wolf. Now, that seeing a wolf is not a passion, it's not an emotion. But when the sheep has an instinctual judgment that this wolf is harmful for it. That's an important stage in the passion. And this is true of any passion. So it has to involve this kind of judgmental, evaluative notion. And this idea that passions have a cognitive or evaluative aspect was very strong in Stoic philosophy, which essentially said that our initial inclinations or eruptions in response to an object do have an evaluative content that we can then morally choose to assent to or dissent from. So they always have this sort of assessment going on, and that's quite important for survival. The sheep example illustrates that, and many of the philosophers of this time pointed this out, that this faculty of instinctual judgment developed to help human beings and animals, because we share these with animals, our passions, to find things which are helpful for our flourishing, our health, essentially, and to avoid things which will probably lead us to death. So there's this instinctual judgment, and oftentimes it's not something we've thought about at length. It's rather just something which is, it's almost built into our apprehension. It's not. It's a separate thing, but it appears to us with this judgment laid into it. And consequently, when we have this judgment, whether something is good or bad for us, this in turn moves what would have been known as the appetite. Now, the appetite, this could be understood as both having a voluntary and involuntary aspect to it. The rational appetite, that appetite which belongs to the rational part of the soul, which I'll go into in more detail soon, is the will, that thing which we choose or choose not to do. By contrast, the involuntary aspect of the appetite is our passions. It is either it is that thing which propels us or moves us away from something, but we don't necessarily control it. It's in response to our judgment about this object that we've apprehended. And this movement, well, there's debates about whether it's a literal or figurative movement, but it is very much understood in spatial terms. If something is seen as good for us, as beneficial to us, will help us to flourish and survive, then our appetites move towards it. Whereas if something is deemed harmful to us, that is when we choose to move. I should say we don't choose, but we instinctually move away from it. We flee from it, they might say. And so in turn, we then act this out. So when the sheep sees the wolf, it instinctually knows or judges that this thing is bad for it. It wouldn't be able to explain it to you. It hasn't thought it through. It just apprehends this. And then its appetite seeks to move away from the wolf and thus runs away. And this is important because the passions are that part of us which move us to activity. They motivate our behavior. They are the keys which drive it. At the same time, there is a physiological component to all of this. So this motion of the appetite is manifested in the way that the heart either expands or contracts. To put this in context, prior to William Harvey's discovery of the nature of circulation of blood in the body, the primary medical theories of kind of medieval era, the ancient era, were those propounded by Galenus. And his ideas, by and large, even in kind of the high-end medical treatises of the time and folk medicinal practices, by and large, relied on his ideas, or at least the caricature of his ideas. And one of these was that blood doesn't necessarily circulate around the body. Rather, the heart can either expand or contract. And well, we know this, it beats, right? That's what it's doing. But they thought that this was either a continual motion either way. And so the blood can be sent to certain parts of the body. And when that blood is there, it contains within it something called the vital spirit. And these vital spirits contained heat, which is the principle of activity or motion. So if you send this blood to a muscle, well, that will cause it to move. And so you have movement. So when it comes to a passion, well, the motion of the heart mirrors that of the appetite. So if you uh, uh, if you apprehend something that's you judge to be good for you, your appetite moves towards it, and the blood, your heart expands, your blood moves outwards to the extremities of your body, and thus the body rises in temperature because heat is being pushed throughout it. And this heat is the experience of the passion. By contrast, if you're fleeing from this object, your appetite wants to get away from it, then all your blood contracts back to the heart and you feel cold. So there's this motion within the body which mirrors the appetite. They're conjoined together. Mixed in with all of this is the doctrine of the humours. Many of you will probably know this uh, um, doctrine already, but it's the idea that with our blood is made up of four substances, and these four substances were known as the humours. You had what was often called blood itself, which is distinct. It was the sanguinian aspect, and this was hot and moist. Then you had phlegm, which was cold and wet. You have melancholy, black bile, which is cold and dry. And you have yellow bile, which is hot and dry. I think, is that right? I think I've got them right there. But they have each of these qualities. There's a moisture quality and there's a temperature quality. And these can have different levels within the blood. Nobody has the same mixture of the humours. And depending on the levels that you have of each humour, you may have a different emotional temperament. And this is because they either restrict or enable the spreading of heat around the body when you're responding to an object. So, for example, the melancholic typically is rather sad. And this is connected to the fact that melancholy, as cold and dry, doesn't allow the body to heat up so much when it is reaching out towards something that it's good. So it doesn't raise the temperature to the levels that you would expect with joy. If anything, it keeps you more permanently in what we might say is a depressed mode. Although you can have healthy balances, right, of the different humours, and you can have unhealthy ones. We'll come to that. I'm getting ahead of myself. But yes, so that can impact the body, can impact the way that the blood circulates, and thus the experience of a passion. But that is the fundamental understanding of the nature of the passions across most early modern thinkers prior to Descartes. So it has this cognitive component of apprehending something via the senses or by thought. It has an evaluative component whereby we judge whether something's good or bad for us. It has this then response from the appetite, and in turn, this is manifested at the same time in bodily change. What's important to note about this is that it's an involuntary process. You can't choose to have the passion directly. It is something which is triggered, it is caused by the object being apprehended by you. And that sets this chain of events in motion. As a consequence, this is why it was called a passion. If we go to the Aristotelian theory of change, which is very important for this, for Aristotle, every change involves an agent which acts and what we might call a patient, which is passive. And the agent acts upon the passive subject, the passive patient, and in so doing changes one of its properties. It can actualize something about it which is potential. And so this is a very this is, well, for Aristotle, this is fundamental to all changes in reality. So then let's apply this to what we've just described. In this case, the object which is apprehended actualizes the appetite. It causes it to move. In so doing, then, the person who is having the passion is passive in relation to the object. It is acting upon them. Not in the sense that it is, it's not like if a person writing on a piece of paper, it's rather, um, it's rather like a computer process almost, that if X happens, then all the other things follow. And this seems to be the case here. It acts upon you insofar as it inputs something into your soul, which then sets off the chain of events. And this is quite important for the ethical side of things that we'll come to. This is also why people will say I was moved in such a way, or I was stirred in response to this object. It's a passive relationship. It's something which happened to me. And I might as well point this out now. In the early modern mindset, supernatural beings could directly do this. So God or the devil could act upon you to trigger this process. The devil, it was thought, could inject thoughts into your mind. They would use that word, inject, or plant suggestions in your apprehension, which would then inflame certain passions, would move your appetite in certain ways, typically in sinful ways. By contrast, God can plant other ideas in your mind or lead you to certain apprehensions about objects, can make you judge them in a certain way, which then triggers the whole process. So again, this is so the passivity of the passions is important because it allows for supernatural agency to trigger these processes in certain directions. And consequently, you find many early modern Puritans arguing that my temptations are not of me; they are from the devil. They're actually a war within my mind, trying to trigger certain emotions. So you are not this isolated, buffered self, as Charles Taylor has argued the modern person sees it as, that is immune to interruption or invasion from another source. In this time period, your very emotions could indicate the presence of another being inside your consciousness, which is a totally alien concept to most of us. I guess the closest thing might be if you've seen the movie Inside Out, the Pixar movie, where each person has a number of, I guess, like each there's little characters running their mind, and different emotions can take over at different points. The emotions are characters, I should say. Maybe it's something like that, that there's a certain agency, not of ourselves, which can be within us and influencing how we judge things and how we feel about things. So, what are the different kinds of motion? Because the appetite can move, but it can move in different ways in response to different evaluations of objects. And, well, one of the common tropes in this period is pointing out everybody has their own version of this, and there's hundreds of schemas about how many basic kinds of passion there are. And it's very much down to the taste of the philosopher in question. However, there are some basic commonalities or assumptions in play, and we can explore these by looking at maybe what you might call the 6 basic passions that you will find articulated in most accounts and express the ideas of most accounts. So, if you have an apprehension of an object and your initial evaluation is that it is good for you, this evokes the passion of love. And all this really means is that you judge it as good and you want this thing, you want to move towards it. In a kind of unconditional way. By contrast, if you apprehend something which is you deem to be bad for you, this arouses hatred of the object. And these are the 2 fundamental dispositions. Though, of course, what you love is going to determine what you then hate, what you judge as bad for you. So fundamentally, love can be seen as the root of all other passions. And this is the Augustinian point of view, and it was very much shared by these thinkers. From each of these affections flow others. So if you want something that you do not currently possess, that you haven't gained the benefit of, your appetite will move towards it in desire, seeking a future good, or a good that is in the future. If you then attain this good, it is now a present good. You judge that you are in the presence of a present good for you, and this arouses joy, which we might say is a resting in the object which you love. By contrast, if you desire to flee something you hate, well, this is aversion, or some say fear. And in turn, if you are unable to escape this thing, then this arouses sadness, a resting, or we might say a troubled rest in an evil object, or an object we see as evil, I should say. And this is again manifested in physiological change. When you love something and desire it, your blood is sent out towards it, outwards from the heart. And when you enjoy it, that is when the blood is most burning in you, as it were. You are most filled with heat. Your heart is on fire, we might say. By contrast, if you hate something and you fear it, then your blood retracts to the heart and you feel cold. And we often talk about trembling in fear, trembling, shivering with coldness. That's where this connection has many of its roots. And if you are in the presence of something which is evil you cannot escape, then you are sad, you're in grief, you're mourning, and this causes ultimate contraction to the heart and coldness throughout the body. Now, this kind of 6-fold basic passions is what we might say is the Stoic conception. So desire and aversion, both future oriented, joy and sorrow both present-oriented, desire and joy, both towards the good, sorrow and aversion against evil. These are that is the Stoic fourfold formula, with the Augustinian emphasis on love tacked on as the foundation. There are other passions beyond these, which we might say, I keep saying that, um, these are the passions which involve conflict between us, between our emotions, or at least they allow room for that. They allow for more complicated responses to things. So, for example, uh, anger is a passion which is aroused when we are in the presence of an evil object which we are unable to escape at the moment, but we wish to retaliate against. So it has as a foundation sorrow, but it is it goes out towards the object in opposition, and this is reflected in our blood, which goes outwards from our heart. And Aquinas would talk about anger as the blood boiling. This is the idea. You are extremely filled with heat, so much so your face might go red with anger, just as it might go red with joy. You also have emotions like hope. Hope being the apprehension of a good object which you do not currently have, which is difficult to get, but you believe you can get it. Whereas despair is likewise the apprehension of an object which you judge to be good for you, but you think it's impossible to get. And so you're left in a state of absolute sorrow over this thing. So we can see that for these people, the motions of the appetite are primarily defined by the object which is apprehended by the person experiencing it. And in turn, this manifests in certain physiological movements too, which are typical of these passions. As I said, most of this understanding is thoroughly Thomistic, and many of the philosophers and people writing on this subject will directly cite him or use very similar language about the passions. There's a small minority, though still notable, who will in various ways support what you might call the Scotist or Duns Scotus's approach to the passions. And I think one of the to boil it down to its basics, for Scotus, the passions begin in the will. He'll say there's passions of the will. What he means is that each of us can choose to like or dislike something. We choose our preferences, and this is a matter of choice. However, when we apprehend an object, this triggers in us the same process of a passion we've just discussed. So I choose to like chocolate. Dairy milk. I love dairy milk. I've chosen that as a preference. And then I see and taste a dairy milk. This arouses in me great pleasure. Now that process is a passive one, thus it is a passion, but it has its beginning in the will, insofar as I have chosen this like. And this might sound too strong in some ways. It might sound implausible because many of our preferences seem to be involuntary or things that we just instinctually enjoy. But it does seem that there are some things, some moments in our lives where we are able to choose whether we will enjoy something or not. That we are able to reject something and in so doing lose any enjoyment from it. I I think it's possible that I could reject a Cadbury's dairy milk as something to like, that I'm going to actively dislike it for some reason. Maybe because of the practices of Cadbury's, let's say. I'm going to take a dislike against their products, the business practices. And thus I may no longer enjoy the dairy milk. Perhaps that's a possibility. That would at least be one way of understanding Scotus's point. The other thing that people will do is they'll challenge Aquinas's understanding of the faculties. Let me explain. So, at the beginning, I mentioned that a passion is often defined as a motion of the sensitive appetite. For medieval thinkers, the faculties are divided into three: the vegetative, the sensitive, and the rational. These are Aristotelian concepts. The vegetative is that which belongs to all living things, so plants, animals, humans. These are the powers to grow and to receive nutrition. So a plant can do this, right? A bacteria can do this. A virus, I suppose. The next stage up is the sensitive. And the sensitive part of the soul is capable of motion and sensory experience. And this belongs to all animals. And so we have sensory cognition. This is perception and the not just the senses themselves, but what collates them, the estimative faculties, the kind of instinctual responses that the sheep might have to an apprehension, and then also their ability to move. And this is where the sensitive appetite is located, is that it's that motion which is in a response to the senses apprehending an object and then judging it. And then this motion, these passions then move the sheep to certain behaviors. And then finally, there is the rational part of the soul. And this belongs exclusively to human beings, which have the power of the intellect, which can apprehend abstract objects such as numbers and concepts, and the will, which has the power of free choice. For Aquinas, the parts of the soul are absolutely distinct. So the sensitive part of the soul does never crosses over into the rational part of the soul, and vice versa. There are certain faculties which may have engagement in some way. So the practical estimative faculty in a human being, so that thing in an animal which judges instinctually, in a human being can tap into the intellect's universal concepts, because it may judge something as good or bad depending on broader principles we might hold. So if we believe all wolves are bad, and then we see a wolf, that practical estimative will then draw that conclusion, draw a practical syllogism, and say, okay, this wolf is bad. But in general, they do not overlap in any way. So for Aquinas, the passions belong to the sensitive part of the soul, and we share these with animals. Affections. Now, this is a matter of great debate within Aquinas studies. Some people will say the affections are motions of the rational appetite. That is, they are choices or decisions of the will. Some will say, others, that affections for Aquinas can refer to both motions of the rational appetite and to motions of the sensitive appetite. And this is important because often they go together. What we choose to do is often motivated by how we feel, and when we make a choice, this can also alter how we feel towards something. So there's affection in that understanding allows a much broader engagement with the nature of these faculties. Scotus doesn't believe that there are these hard and fast divisions. They're only functional differences. They're not essential. And so he would not see the rational and the sensitive faculties as distinct faculties, but rather two ways of looking at the same thing, the soul, but operating in different ways. So he's able to see these processes as overlapping and blending together. And some early modern thinkers prefer that approach. So we have this idea that passions or affections are motions towards things in relation to whether they're good or bad for us. And this is proportional, right? So the worse we think something is, the more powerful our experiences or our feelings of fear and sorrow are going to be. Whereas the more powerful something, the greater good we think something is, the more powerful our desire and joy is going to be. So one of the metaphors some early modern writers will use is comparing our affections to a river going down a channel towards an object. And this is quite apt because of the motional aspect of a river. However, a river can sometimes overflow its banks if it has too much water in it. And this is the character of what is often called an inordinate passion or affection, an inordinate affection or passion. This is when it's gone beyond its proportional relationship, and so it has one that is out of proportion with the object at hand. So, for example, I'll go back to it. I enjoy Mars bars, right? They're very tasty. But what if my passion for a Mars bar is too much, that I love them so much that I then start eating them 3 a day? That is not healthy for me. It's also an obsession, which is not proportional to the value of a Mars bar, particularly as they're not very good for me. Although they're pleasurable, they're not necessarily good. So my passion for this thing is inordinate. It is overflowing. It is too much. And like a river that's burst its banks, this means that it is running, the water is going everywhere, away from where it should be going. Additionally, I may have the wrong object. I've already kind of alluded to this, but let's make a clearer example. Take something like, let's take a very dark example, murder. Some people get their kicks. We've seen, lots of people have seen detective shows where the killer is often revels and enjoys hurting people and killing people. Now, to them, this is something that they enjoy, and on this kind of reading, it's because they love it. They apprehend it as something good that will give them pleasure. But while it may give you pleasure, that does not mean it is morally good for you. It is not helpful for you. It is not something which will ultimately satisfy the soul. And this disjunction between what is pleasurable and what is good for us is explained by, for these writers, by the fall. Initially, our apprehensive faculties were able to determine what is good for us by its pleasurability. And those things which were good for us were able to arouse in us great joy. However, after the fall of Adam, when the original sin was committed and the fruit from the forbidden tree of the knowledge of good and evil was taken and eaten, this has been lost. It has been corrupted. Our faculties are no longer reliable because they are tainted by sinfulness. And thus they are often directed towards things which, though we see them as good for us, are actually bad for us. And those things that we see as evil, we interpret as evil, are often good for us and would give us actually more pleasure in the long run. So there's this question of, on the one hand, do we have the right objects for our passions? Are we being aroused by the right things in the right ways and to the right extent? We might call this the matter of a passion, its object. Do we have the right object for that passion? And its manner, the extent to which we're reacting to something. And I think this is a very helpful matrix for analyzing a lot of things in our lives, in terms of whether things when we have powerful emotions, whether we're being moved in ways which are appropriate for the thing that's in front of us. It gives us a framework for rationally analyzing these things. In the Stoic point of view, these initial impulses are morally neutral. They do not have any moral value of themselves because we did not choose them. They were triggered by these objects. What comes next is a judgment of the mind and will, at least in Seneca's interpretation, in his treatise on anger, where we can either choose to assent to this thing, to our initial judgment about it, or we can reject it. And in most Stoic philosophy of the classical kind, there's a strong emphasis upon rejecting most of our impulses because they're irrational, that they're not guided by reason. And we should instead, even though we may feel these things, we should choose a way which is conversant and concurrent with the way of the universe, which is a very hard thing to do. And not many people are able to do it. And often this gets mischaracterized as a total rejection of emotion, that we should have no emotions. That is not the understanding of the passions which somebody like Seneca has. He's rather saying we should reject most of our initial impulses, and those which are in accordance with reason we should embrace. This idea is similar, but a bit distinct from the one that is dominant in this period, which has a kind of Aristotelian root to it. And it's the idea that these passions, even if they are out with our control, most of the time they are morally bad. They are evil. And this is because they are pursuing things which are against the will of God, as expressed in the Ten Commandments and clarified in later scripture, particularly in the Sermon on the Mount and Jesus' teachings. For example, although the commandment says, "Thou shalt not murder," Jesus says, if you have hatred in your heart, you have broken this commandment. Likewise, the commandment not to commit against committing adultery, Jesus says, if you have lust in your heart, then you have broken this commandment. So we see that even these sorts of emotions or passions which we may feel we're unable to control are being deemed as sinful. In the medieval era, there was quite a bit of debate about when exactly an impulse or a first movement becomes sinful. But by this point, especially in the Reformed tradition, the way of Peter Lombard has prevailed, as often it did in the Reformed tradition. And it's the whole thing which is sinful. Whereas maybe Jesuits like Robert Bellarmine would have said, actually, there is a moment where your initial impulse, you can't help it, but as soon as you consent to it in your mind, as soon as you entertain it, then it is sinful. The Aristotelian perspective that's kind of built into this is that a passion needs to be moderated by reason. It can either be too great, overspilling its banks, or it can be too little. So, for example, one might respond to a situation of battle with cowardice or with maybe brashness. In these two cases, we've responded poorly. We've responded irrationally to the situation. On the one hand, our fear has overwhelmed us, and thus we have too little of what we need. But brashness, foolhardiness, is also not good. It gets us killed because we run in without an appropriate amount of fear. What we really need is something between these two vices, which is courage. And courage is the median between these two. And that is thus the rational perspective. And for Aristotle, all of the virtues are moderate dispositions towards having passions in the right way, at the right time, to the right extent. Reason thus governs the passions by drawing them within bounds of moderation. It is like building the flood defenses along the river so that it constantly goes the right direction. Or we might take a Platonic allegory, in which I think it's in the Phaedrus. He talks about how the soul is like a chariot, the chariot of the soul. The passions are the horses which pull the chariot, and the charioteer is the one who steers it, and he is reason. In this case, then, if the horses are allowed to lead, if there is not a good driver in place, then they will go astray. They will go towards things which appear good to them, but are not necessarily good for the soul. By contrast, if the driver is a good driver, and he will direct them towards the way that they need to go, which is good for the soul. Moderation does differ from person to person. Aristotle makes the point that if you take somebody's diet, moderation for an average person is not the same as for a world-class athlete. What they both need is proportional to their different functions. And that's the same for the individual, particularly given the humoral variations between us. Some of us have more melancholy in our blood, others more phlegm, others yellow bile, and so on. And in turn, this changes our temperaments. Some of us are more prone to depression or anger or joy. And each of these can have a healthy, moderate quality, or they can be overwhelming. We can be overcome with melancholy to the point where it can be rather dangerous. At the same time, if we're too prone to joy, this can be very distracting from the things where we need to be very serious. This understanding is not too dissimilar from saying that various hormonal aspects to our lives impact our temperaments and can chemical changes in our bodies, chemical imbalances can influence our moods and responses to emotions. So it's not a terribly distinct idea. One of the more controversial aspects of this, though, is that for Aristotle, and this gets very much carried through into this period, is the idea that the men and women are biologically quite different in their ability to control their passions by reason. For Aristotle, a man is the fullness of human nature. He is its seed developed to its most full, and this is because the man is hotter, is filled with heat, and heat is the principle of activity, and thus is connected to reason, insofar as the rational part of the soul is not passive, it is not acted upon, it is that thing which is able to act by itself. By contrast, a woman for Aristotle, a female, is a not fully formed male. In the womb, they were not as hot and so unable to develop the further faculties, particularly the genitalia of the male, but also, as a consequence, the rationality of the male. Women are less able to control their emotions via reason. And this idea gets carried through into the early modern period, so that the male, which is deemed as active, and the female, which is deemed as passive, becomes a very principle of being itself in Paracelsus's alchemical understanding of the universe. Activity becomes male, passivity becomes female. One of the implications of this is that the female is assumed to be able to be more in touch with the supernatural, or more prone to supernatural influences. This could be positive insofar as the divine could more readily act upon the female soul because it is more inclined to passivity. And in turn, this allows for greater communion with God and religious experiences. This is something like Maria Dila Domingo in the early 16th century in Spain used to her advantage. She was a beata. She was a very poor woman from a farming community who claimed to have visions sent from the Lord. And part of the plausibility of her claims within that culture was that as a woman who was poor, it was seen that she would be more open to the divine influence, and this would explain why she, as somebody who had no university education, could articulate very profound doctrines. She's somebody that was open to the influence of God acting upon her. At the same time, though, this passivity enables darker influences to operate upon the soul. It was thought that just as God might be able to act upon a female and thus make them into a visionary or a mystic of some kind, so too could the devil. And so there was great fear in this period, in 16th century Spain, about females who claimed to be mystics, and the Inquisition trying to test whether this was something that they believed was from God or was the devil acting on the soul. Teresa of Avila had to wrestle with this in her self-writings and had to basically try to show her readers that her passions, her very powerful experiences of Christ were not from the devil, because this was a very distinct possibility, and that women were more open to it because of their passive natures. And when I say passive, let's be clear about this, because I think people misunderstand the point being made here. Teresa of Avila was a very active woman. She founded the Discalced Carmelite order. She was not somebody who you would say is passive in a conventional sense. It's passive in a metaphysical sense, that you are more open. A passive object is that which is acted upon by something else, which produces a change. And the idea in this worldview, which was seen as common sense to most people was that males were more prone to activity because of their hotter natures, and connected to that, their more rational natures, while females, being cooler, were more passive in the relationship of activity, of change. Another implication of this, then, is if the male is more more rational, and the emotions need to be moderated by reason, then it stands to follow that men should rule over to the women, that the male reason should be used to govern and guide the female proneness to emotionality. This was the common view during this period. The father should be the head of the household. He is the governor of his kingdom, you might say. And then this escalates all the way up through society. So we should not have a female in charge of us, so the logic goes, because they are more emotional and thus prone to being led by the passions rather than, which are unmoderated, rather than by reason. This is why there is such fear and concern when somebody like Mary, Queen of Scots, or Elizabeth I is Queen of the country, or at least one of the reasons, especially with Elizabeth. And such rulers like Elizabeth has to present her character in masculine terms. Though I do not have the body of a man, I have the soul or the spirit, and so on. So this has very important implications given the concerning gender relationships, given the framework of the metaphysical framework of the period. And this also this also escalates to political policy. The idea that the soul should be moderated by reason is something which moves in the Elizabethan context to church policy, so that we should have moderation in all things, to governmental policy, and so on. There seems to be this idea that how the soul should be governed should be mirrored by how society should be governed. Everything should be in harmony with basic principles. On the flip side, let's take the Puritan point of view, which does not necessarily advocate for moderation, but its great emphasis is upon absolute godliness, the constant drive towards finding purity in oneself and rooting out any trace of sinfulness. On this model, the soul should be a place of constant warfare against sin, as should society. The magistrates of any community, supported by the church, should be rooting out and punishing any wickedness they come across. This is why they can justify banning Christmas. This is why they can justify banning the theatre, because the same principle, which is about governing the soul, should also be driving governance of society, and we should have absolute harmony up and down. Somebody like Hugh Binning, who was a minister in Glasgow during the 17th century, would talk about how creation was brought into being by God on the principle of charity, and all things accord to this principle in their original state. With the fall, we have fallen away from this. But if we want to have a good life, then our souls, our societies, must be brought back into accord with this cosmic principle. And then all things will be in uniform, proportional relationships. It's very influenced by, on the one hand, Pythagoras, with his understandings of the harmonies of the spheres, and how even all motion is musical in nature, and so in that way, it would there would be a chord um, in perfect harmony in both mathematical proportion and a musical sound. And with Vitruvius, the Roman kind of philosopher of architecture, who would um, he had this idea of proportionality as being key to beauty. Things are beautiful if they're proportional to one another in shape and size and so on. So we have these two ideas underpinning this notion of um, the principle which governs the soul should also govern everything else, and vice versa. So we can see this in a couple of ways, manifesting in the actual disciplinary structures or punishments that we used during this time. The Scots bridle, and also known as the branks in Scotland, were a disciplinary device, primarily used in Scotland, I should say, but were also used in England as well. Let me see if I can find a um, an image of one so you can see it. Let's see. Here we go. I'll try Scots bridle. That might be a bit. No, let's see, because it'll be good to actually show you. Here we go. Here we go. It's not a very big picture. Well, that'll do. That'll do. So let's see. Can I share this picture? So hopefully you can see this. Let me try and zoom in a bit, so you get a. So this is what you would call a skull. Oh, sorry, that's a horse, not a skull's bridle. And typically, it was dished out as a punishment when somebody was found to be either a slanderer, having insulted somebody, or defamed somebody. Now, this was very important in this society, these sorts of things, as it is today. But particularly then, because it was a verbal society, most people couldn't write or read. And so one's word had legal force during this period. And if somebody was found to have defamed you, it could destroy your social and economic reputation and relationships. In turn, often words could cause violence. If somebody was insulted or felt slighted, then there was a terrible problem with blood feuds and retaliation during this period. As a consequence, if somebody was found guilty through a process of investigation, often using witness testimony to prove a case, and this was typically in the Scottish context done by kirk sessions, who were responsible in many ways for administering the justice process when it dealt with things which weren't deemed capital offences like murder. So in this case, say somebody had been proven to have defamed somebody else. So an example would be they had accused them of adultery, and it was unfounded, without evidence. Then often what would take place then is if the person had confessed this crime, had admitted that they had done this thing, they would be asked to do two things, essentially. One would be to make satisfaction for what they have done, and then to perform what was known as public repentance. And in public repentance, this was a kind of ritual that the church did, whereby one would have to profess their contrition for what they had done and be reconciled to the community if they were deemed to have been sorry enough for this. But the satisfaction part, this could either be decided by the church or by the magistrates. It's different in different communities. And essentially, the principle would be of one of humiliation in a public context. So, for example, with the Scold's Bridle, perhaps for 24 hours or 48 hours, you would have to be chained to the market cross, the most central part of the town, and wear this device upon your head. Now, note in particular with this cage, which is very uncomfortable, that there is this bit at the very jutting inwards from it. Now, this bit is to go in your mouth. It is to essentially silence you. You cannot speak while this is in your mouth. And indeed, some of them might be quite sharp. So if you were trying to move around and resist, that you would get cut in your mouth, particularly as you're being dragged to the market cross. So this device is essentially it's not only very humiliating and painful, it's also a lesson insofar as it is trying to restrain your tongue. It is literally like bridling the horse. You know, we were talking about steering the horse in the chariot before. In this case, this person's behavior is being brought into line, back into moderation. That's the idea with this device, or at least it's an implicit idea with it. We also have other devices during this period. So, for example, let's see. I'll get a couple of them up before I share this time. So, right, and then yes, that will do. So, let me share now again. Okay, so these are what were known as the Jukes. And you would often find these on market crosses as well, or also they would be on outside churches. And essentially, the person who had been found guilty of an offense would be chained around the collar with one of these and forced to stand, often in uh, linen or sackcloth, bareheaded and barefoot, with this on for everybody in the community to see. And they would often be wearing a hat or a sign with their offense written on it, and perhaps would also have a little object indicating the nature of their offense. So if you had stabbed somebody, for example, you may have a wooden knife in your hands, etc., etc. So again, this is something which is in full view of everybody. You're absolutely humiliated and degraded through this process. Everybody can see. The idea is, in one way, that that you are shamed for your action, and thus this is hope. The one of the hopes is this will stir shame in the person who's being held there about their action, and thus contrition for the reconciliation process. It's also a way of bringing about fear in passers-by that they will not also commit this crime, that they don't want to be put in this horrible position either. But again, it's a form of restraint. You're physically restrained to in the terms of the king's, the market cross, this is the center and symbol of royal and governmental authority within a town. It literally is the place where the king's proclamations are made. It's also the place where the king's peace is symbolized. So you are being restrained by the government in your movement, in your motion. Likewise, if you're outside a church, you're being restrained by ecclesiastical discipline, by the authority of the church to do this and bring you, your behavior, and thus your passions into line. Now, let me see if I can show you one final picture. Let's see, before we move on to another point. So this is what was called the Ducking Stool or the Cucking Stool. And there's various variations of this practice too. And this would be used both in formal processes, but in England, I've mainly been talking about Scotland, which through the Kirk sessions had a somewhat formal disciplinary process in many communities, certainly by the 17th century. Whereas in England, the parish church didn't seem to have quite the same power, nor did the magistrates in terms of these sorts of sins. So local communities would often take it upon themselves to deliver what they perceived to be justice for crimes which destabilized community harmony. So we might call this vigilantism or folk popular rituals. And this was in the literature, it's often called rough music. And I thoroughly recommend you read anything by, I think it's David Underdown or David Underwood. He's very good on this. Anyhow, one of the punishments would be this stool, which, as you can see, is a very long contraption with a stool very much at the end. And often the perceived offender would be carted around town, placed on a horse or a donkey, often backwards because they've upturned community norms, so they are placed in the wrong way around. And people would often throw insults at them and rotten tomatoes and things like that. And then they would be placed on the ducking stool and thus then plunged, well, sometimes into rivers. That would be very fortunate, actually, because other times it was into things like dung carts or foul water. And the idea here, in part, especially in the latter two I've just mentioned, is that the passions, as I said, belong to the animal part of the soul. They do not belong to the rational. They need to be governed by the rational. So this person has, in essence, become less than human. They are being guided by their animal instincts. And so they belong with the animal in the dung heap. That's kind of the symbolic connection beyond just making fun of these people. Now, one of the things I wanted to mention here was that many of the people who are going to go into these punishments, well, there's debate about the extent, but I think it's fair to say that most would have been women, certainly on the ducking stool, which was also known as the cucking stool for a reason. That in Elizabethan England and in Jacobean Scotland, there was a great fear that women would be having extramarital affairs, essentially, that they would make their husbands into cucks. And so these stools become synonymous with that. But interestingly enough, the scold, the slanderer, is also identified as the licentious woman. They're bound together. So this obsession both with fornication, that's the main crime that's being punished during this period, and with slander, they're both seen as synonymous because they're both aroused in the passions, which are rebelling against authority, rational authority, masculine patriarchal authority, and thus they need to be brought into line. So often it is women who are more identified with the passions who are going to be the natural targets of this. So we can see it's a very misogynistic interpretation, and the real life practical consequences of some of these ideas is pretty horrible punishments. So I wanted to bring this back round to something else, though, because we've mentioned that many of these ideas they're about shaming and humiliating people into certain kinds of behavior, right? And thus enabling them to restrain their passions. In theory, through reason, which is identified with authoritative governance, but perhaps in practice because of the fear of going through one of these rituals, or the scars of going through one of these rituals, and the desire never to have that humiliation again or done to you. But what some of the ministers of this period would say, such as Robert Bruce, who was the minister of St. Giles Cathedral in Edinburgh, is that although this changes maybe your behavior, it doesn't really get to the root of the problem, which is your passions, your desires. You still have that desire to do the thing which was deemed to be bad. You still have, let's say, overwhelming lust, but now you're just not acting upon it because you're afraid of being punished in this way. You're still committing the sin of lust, essentially. So something else is needed if it is to be, if it's to be, if you're going to be transformed and redeemed in this way. And for Bruce and others, this comes about through the power of the Holy Spirit in the process of sanctification. Namely, and this is mediated through the preaching of the minister. The law, the preaching of the law, which is, or the covenant of works, essentially proclaims that if one perfectly obeys God, they will be, in the old covenant before the fall, they will be saved. However, nobody is capable of this because of original sin, and thus everyone is worthy of damnation. Now, the key with such preaching is to convince you that you've committed a sin and that you will go to hell for it. Such should awaken you to the reality of your sin and the terrible situation you're in. It's about transforming the way you apprehend it, right? Before, you apprehended that thing as good for you because maybe it gives you pleasure or something else, and then you did it. However, such preaching is trying to change your estimation of that object. It's saying, no, actually, this is really bad for you. Not only does it break God's law, but it condemns you to an eternity in hell. This then, hopefully, in the minister's point of view here, is going to arouse feelings of fear of God's just judgment and justice, terror perhaps, and it could be very extreme. People were known to have attempted suicide in response to this. So it was a very powerful effect that it could have. But this was not supposed to be the end of the process. It was supposed to be a preparation for the preaching of the gospel. Some preachers were not very good at it, but others very much were, such as Bruce. The idea here is once you've worked somebody to this point where they've despaired of their ability to perform good works and thus receive salvation because of their works, then you preach to them that God is merciful and their sins will be forgiven through the atoning work of Jesus Christ. This in turn should arouse assurance and confidence of one's salvation, given that they have a feeling of God's mercy within their bosom, a joy then, a hope. And thus this should work, because they've got joy in the unearned grace of God. This should in turn start to work new emotions, Firstly, a hatred of sin, a desire to root sin out of your life, to not see it as good anymore, but evil, as working against the one who has saved you. This is mortification, putting to death the sins of the heart. And in turn, it should also breathe vivification, that is, love for God, love for good things, holy things. So we see in this process of preaching, oh, and I should say here as well, godly sorrow. So you're not just afraid of the consequences of sin, which are those, um, judgment, right? Because you're not actually sorry for the sin itself, but for how it's going to affect you. That's what happens when the first preaching of the law takes place in your life. But at this point, now that you love God and you hate sin, you are sorry for the sin itself, for the offense it has caused to God, to the church, to offended parties. And this is the key to contrition. For Bruce, this is what's needed to really deal with the passions, with their wayward character. It's not enough to restrain them through external punishment. The Holy Spirit must transform the soul so that what it used to love, it now hates, and what it used to hate, it now loves. I think then this provides a very interesting um, counterpoint to the current debates around sexual desire that I was mentioning at the beginning of the stream, in relation to the ideas of, is virtue a restraint of desire? Is this something that we should be pursuing? Indeed, is it something that's important, or given kind of very in the 20th century, the therapeutic worldview that many of us have been kind of influenced by, the idea that our psychological health and our happiness are identical. So then our fulfillment of our desires is a matter of our psychological health. Thus, we should do so. So restraining our desires is a bad thing on that view. This provides maybe a third way between these 2 points. It's not a matter of pursuing our current desires or restraining them. What's needed is that we need new desires. Our current desires are not good, and we need to be changed to desire the right things, the things of God, the things of charity and hope and faith. And this requires a very powerful and dramatic and sometimes traumatic conversion process for these thinkers. That, I think, is where I want to leave it with this talk. I think that's an interesting point to leave it on. I just want to give folks a couple of minutes if they want to ask any questions, because I appreciate there was a lot of material there, and I think is there may be things people want to clarify before we all head off. I should say as well, this is a perspective which, despite changes in the understanding of emotions, persisted well into the 19th century with figures like Thomas Chalmers. If you read his writings on the affections, he very much believes that and I did a stream on him actually it must be about a year ago now. Essentially, he argues that good preaching doesn't just condemn things, because frankly, we are creatures of love, and love is a good thing. We desire things, and that's what drives our lives, what we desire, absolutely. But the problem is, much preaching is about condemning what we love and saying it is evil. However, the human heart cannot stand being in a position where it doesn't love anything, where it doesn't desire something as its absolute good. And so even if one knows that what they're doing is bad, they'll go back to it because they have no alternative. Otherwise, they would be in a terrible situation where they're driven by nothing and love nothing. And at the same time, what's needed then, in Chalmers' view, is preaching which presents something more lovely and more desirable than what we already desire and love. Something which will give us higher and greater pleasures, more permanent pleasure than what we already seek for our pleasure. In other words, we need to present the loveliness of God and transform people's desires so that they're not based on they're not trying to cut their desires, as it were. They're not trying to restrain their current desires. We're arousing new ones in them. And that's very much the view that Bruce was making. So when it comes to these debates about should we restrain our current sexual desires or not, the question I want to ask is, should we have, what kinds of sexual desire are good? Is kind of the wrong question, but rather, what sorts of new desires are we going to have when the power of the Holy Spirit transforms us? All our sexual desires will be transformed in some way by that. And I think that's a very important point. And that's true of all these other virtues and vices that are being talked about. It's not just a question of restraining our greed for food. It's actually, do we have a new relationship to food when our minds are so altered by supernatural power that we see it in a new way, that we perceive its goodness in a new way, beyond just how tasty it is or how healthy it is. Maybe we see it in terms of justice, for example, how just this thing is in relation to it, who made it and how it was made. That might be a new way of thinking about it. Anyway, so yes, let's see. Prince of Parma has sent in $5. Thank you very much, sir. He says, at risk of lowering the high tone of the stream, please say emotional damage. Emotional damage. I'm not sure if that's referring to something else, but I'll say it a third time for you, my friend. Emotional damage. Yes. So, yeah, it doesn't seem like there's any further questions. I just want to say again, thank you for all tuning in. And I've really enjoyed talking about this. It's something that I think is endlessly fascinating, and seeing the ways that it interconnects with so many other areas of early modern culture and life. I find it really helpful because you can see the inner logic and connections of things and why things were in place. Even though I think many of them, we can question and challenge and think we're wrong or right. We can at least see the inner logic, and the passions give us a key to that. So I think I found it enjoyable, and I hope some of you have too. Yes. Anyhow, thank you again for tuning in. I do very much appreciate it, and I hope to see you soon. I may be doing. I haven't done it for a few weeks now, but I'm hoping maybe at the weekend I might do Story Hour again. We've been going through The Princess and the Goblin. We've got another few weeks to go on that. But then the next couple of weeks, I probably won't be able to stream for various for various reasons. So it won't. So after then, it will probably be in late July or August that I might be able to come back. We just have to. I'll just have to see. I'll just have to see. But till then, may God's grace be with you all, and I hope you have a pleasant morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are, whoever you are. God bless.